Sciences at the University of Arizona. When he was active, he directed the Department of Atmospheric Sciences. I don't mean to imply you're inactive right now, Philip, but that was what you did for money, and the Institute of Atmospheric Physics. And his specialties are research in the physics of lightning, lightning detection, lightning protection, cloud electricity, and other issues in atmospheric electricity. Our second guest is Dr. Hal Wallace. He is curator of the electricity collections in the Division of Work and Industry at the Smithsonian National Museum of American History. And he has an extensive series of exhibitions on his CV on topics ranging from electric power regulation, radar, lasers, holograms, fuel cells, and many, many more. So I can't think of a more wide range of guests and expertise today to kick off this session. So welcome, Philip. Welcome, Hal. We're really glad to have you here. Just as an aside, the normal host, David Randall, was called away, and so I'm substitute hosting for him. I'm Scott Turner. I'm Director of the Diversity of Intrusion of Sciences, of Diversity in the Sciences project at the National Association of Scholars. So once again, welcome to the two of you.
Thank you for having us.
Okay, so what we're going to do today is we're going to ask both of our guests to give a short presentation. Philip will go first and Hal will go second. And we might have a little bit of back and forth discussion, but primarily the agenda for the seminar is to hear what you guys have to say, and also to allow our listeners to have their say and ask questions as well. I would ask that we welcome questions. Please put them in the Q&A. If you happen to put them in the chat session, that's no fatal error. Don't worry, we'll try and get to it, but we prefer the interactivity of the Q&A box as well. All right, so again, welcome, Philip. Why don't we ask you to go first, and you have a PowerPoint presentation titled Lightning and Lightning Protection. Let me just bring this up on the screen here for you. And let me get it here, right? There's no sound on your presentation, is there, Philip?
I don't know.
Okay. Okay. Well, we'll go from
I guess
there.
I'm muted.
Okay. All right. So we're screen sharing right now. I'm hoping that everyone sees the PowerPoint presentation coming up.
Yes, we see it.
Great. Okay. All right. So Philip, just tell me when to advance the slides. I'm starting your slide presentation now.
Okay, can you go back to where I appear?
I can close the screen. Sure. Yeah.
I just wanted to show you one of the earliest electrical apparatus
yeah.
Franklin developed and was very proud of, actually.
Uh-huh.
This is an upholstery needle used in upholstery work. And I've got the regular needle is real sharp on one end, and it has a round ball, a doorknob on the other end that I soldered in there. But this apparatus is basically serving two functions in Franklin's mind initially. First, it was an electroscope to demonstrate the power of points and to apply that power of points in the natural environment. And he discovered that there was electricity in the thundery environment, and through the famous experiment at Marly-la-Ville in France, and later his own work with the electrical kite, where he flew a sharp point aloft and demonstrated that thunderclouds contain electricity, and therefore the lightning may be an electrical discharge. Now, we can probably go back to just me, or the PowerPoint slide.
Okay. All right. Here we go.
And so we had those two applications. First, just to detect electricity or an electroscope, and the second to provide protection from lightning. This shows Franklin. First slide shows Franklin at his desk in Philadelphia, and it shows how he detected electricity in the natural environment with his famous electrostatic bells that you see on the left of the PowerPoint slide. And the basic idea is when the sharp point became electrified, and this bell on the right was detected, went out through an insulated junction in the ceiling out into the natural environment. And it had a funnel type protection to keep the rain from falling in and destroying the insulating properties of where it went through the roof. And in any case, so he used the power of points as manifested by a sharp point that went up out through his house. And that was the way he detected the electricity, and he was able to measure the roughly the magnitude and the polarity of the electricity with those bells in his office. In the insert to the right, you can see the one application of a sharp point to intercept lightning and provide protection in a thundering environment. You basically put the point on your roof. We could go to the next slide probably. And where it goes out the top, it acts as an air terminal as defined by the current lightning protection code. And as long as you have a sharp point up there that is properly grounded through conductors that run horizontally on the roof and called roof conductors, or vertically to the ground that we call down conductors into a grounding system, that they're basically those three elements of a protection system. And let's see the next slide. I kind of forget what it is. Yeah, the NFPA standard for lightning protection systems is still today pretty much what Franklin recommended after a few years of experience with his first system. The main problems with his system, next slide. Oh, I can show how a normal lightning develops between the cloud and ground. Can you click the, see if it gets, we may have problem with this one.
Yeah.
It's an animated GIF.
Yeah, if it's not embedded in the PowerPoint,
It is
embedded
in the PowerPoint, but it may be
okay.
not playable.
Yeah, I'm not able to play it. I don't see a.
Well, what it shows is a downward progression of a lightning.
No, never mind. Yes, okay. I'm sorry.
Starting up in the cloud, and it comes down. The normal lightning are coming downward from a negative cloud base and interacting with a tall tower on the top of a mountain in this case, which is tall enough to actually initiate an upward discharge, which we call a connecting leader. And the downward propagation from the cloud is in the form of a stepwise development of a negative discharge coming down. And Franklin actually discovered that the base of thunderclouds tends to be negative most of the time. And in effect, the current going upward, if you define that as the flow of positive current, positive charge, that he realized that most lightnings to ground are in fact conveying positive charge upward. So that might be the reverse of what you'd expect. And in any case, let's try the next slide. So this is an example of an air terminal that was installed in the 19th century. And it's a YF drawing, and I always like it because I think it's really pretty. Next slide. One problem with air terminals that were, his first air terminals were like the thin conductor I showed you at the beginning, the upholstery needle. And they were, one of the problems with his first recommendation for the air terminals, they're too thin, because the current in a lightning is much bigger than he thought for protection. So this is what he published in the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society, showing an air terminal that got melted by the lightning current. And it was taken by his colleague in Philadelphia, Kinnersley. And let's see the next slide. So the early conductors from the rod to the ground were in the form of a chain of nail rods, such as shown in this slide, taken in Philadelphia near the Gloria Dei Old Swedish Church. And it was the conductors carrying the current from the lightning air terminals were chains of these nail rods. And next slide. And they were linked or hooked together with just a mechanical link. And one of the problems with that is they are often not good enough. So you had a gap where the links connected, and if you, in that case, the links tended to explode behind a high pressure arc and in the metal, and therefore were not providing good protection. Next slide. It may be the cause they'd run these conductors inside a church steeple, for example, which were typically nailed or tacked to the inside wood, and they could easily start a fire. It may have been the cause of some fires inside a church, such as this one in Philadelphia. It also may not have been that cause, but I think it's likely. The next slide. When the current gets into the ground, this is showing the surface arcs that develop on the ground at the point where lightning attaches. In this case, it was a rocket-triggered lightning discharge in Alabama. The ground rod was driven about 3 feet into the ground, just that. And it was too short, didn't make good electrical contact with the ground. And so on the surface of the ground, you had these arcs form. And those arcs can propagate outward probably 30 or 40 feet from the point at which the lightning rods are struck. So the early grounding systems were not adequate compared to what you really need to protect yourself against lightning. We could go to the next slide. The surface arcs are familiar to people who have studied lightning damage to golf courses and places like that, where you can see where those arcs are burning the grass on the ground. And in this case, they propagated outward at least 30 feet, 10 meters from the point of contact. In this case was a flagpole in the center of a green that was there before that. Oh, I'm having a problem with my computer losing the. Why don't we just quickly look at the next slide?
Yeah, we can hear you and see you just fine, Philip.
Another thing you can do to protect your house, for example, from the current in the ground is run the air terminal and the down conductor out away from the foundation of the house, so the explosive arcs don't damage your foundation. This was the recommendation of Franklin after about 10 years of experience operating them as lightning protection devices. Next slide. Not all lightning goes down from the cloud, but sometimes it starts at the ground and goes up. Typically from tall towers or mountains, they go in this direction a lot of the time, not all the time, but they often make very beautiful patterns such as these. Try the next slide. And I thought I put a couple of these, what the view of people who were using lightning rods. People generally were astonished that there was electricity in the natural environment, and they immediately began to do a lot of other experiments. But just simply the demonstration that there was electricity in the environment itself was interesting. And then, of course, the protection provided by lightning rods installed properly In this case, it was described by John Adams in a memo of 1811 that you could read it. It says, nothing perhaps that ever occurred on this earth was so well calculated to give any man an extensive and universal celebrity as the discovery of the efficacy of iron points and the invention of lightning rods. He says the idea was one of the most sublime that entered the human imagination, that an immortal should disarm the clouds of heaven and snatch from his hand the scepter and the rod. That's a pretty strong recommendation from a man who actually hated Franklin personally at that point. But we'll see the next slide. It talks about how the invention of the lightning rod as a protective device principally was received, and he developed his scientific reputation was more universal than that of Leibniz, Newton, Frederick, or Voltaire, and his character more beloved and esteemed than any or all of them. And this is describing his action as a philosopher later when he was acting in a diplomatic arena. His name was familiar to government and people, to kings, the courtiers, nobility, clergy, philosophers, as well as the ordinary man. And there wasn't anybody that didn't consider him as a friend to humankind. When they spoke of him, they thought he was going to be able to restore the golden age. A really amazing endorsement from a man who didn't really like Franklin very much. But that was one effect of this discovery of the action of points, both as electroscopes to detect simply the lightning or electricity, and to also provide protection when properly applied. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Philip, for that fascinating discussion. You know, the caricature of Franklin is he flew a kite and he discovered electricity, and this really fills in the real achievement of Franklin and as a scientist, actually, and I think that's often not as appreciated as it should be. You know, and thank you for filling that in.
And he not only discovered electricity in the natural environment, he provided protection against lightning, which is a truly extraordinary accomplishment. Absolutely. When properly applied.
Absolutely, yes. Okay, so we'll come back to that theme as we get into the Q&A and our discussions. So Hal, you're kind of an interesting historian, museum curator, and also kind of an expert in physics as well. So over to you.
I don't know that my undergraduate physics professor would agree with that last statement, but
yeah.
But thank you for inviting me to participate. We currently have an exhibition here at the American History Museum that looks at Franklin and his electrical work. And that gave me the opportunity to really dive into that aspect of his very full life. And there were a number of things that came up that I find very interesting about Franklin and electricity. For one, as Philip said, his work made him a global celebrity as the man who tamed lightning, and he rode that fame for the rest of his life. But as important as that work was, his contributions to electrical science went a lot deeper than that. And he was a careful experimenter, dedicated to what we now call the scientific method, test, empirical theory, write up your results, publish. He was really devoted to that approach to research. What's really interesting is that his active electrical work only occupied a brief period of his very long life. Remember, he was born in 1806, died in 1890, so 84 years old. He became interested in the topic around 1743. Not long before the invention of the Lyden Jar. And by 1752, he had turned to other activities by and large. So it's less than 10 years, really 6 years that he's really active, experimenting and writing up the results and doing his work. He retires, he's one of a large family of craftspeople from Boston. Goes to Philadelphia at age 17, becomes a printer there, and is successful enough to retire from printing in 1742, and really begins to look around for things to do. And he becomes enamored of this new electrical research that he's reading about, that's largely happening on the continent and in England, in Europe. But by 17, so he dives into this. By 1751, he's beginning to be involved in a lot of other things. He founds what becomes the University of Pennsylvania. He's been a Crown officer for a number of years, running the post office, basically, or helping to run the postal service. And that job kind of ramps up around 1753 and occupies more of his time. He gets really involved in politics, attending the Albany Congress in 1754. And then he goes to London in 1757 and spends most of the next 20 years in London as representative for 4 colonies, not just Pennsylvania, but Massachusetts and New Jersey and Georgia as well. Representing their interest in the court of St. James. So though he stays in contact with people who are doing electrical work, his most active days are those few years between about 1746 and 1751, 1752. He publishes the proposals for the experiments on lightning in 1750, although those experiments aren't actually performed until 1752. But another interesting part of this is he's doing his work in Philadelphia, which is on the edge, the frontier, if you will, of the British Empire at that time. And this has drawbacks for him. A lot of the research that's going on and is being written up in books and journal articles and so forth, friends, principally Peter Cullinson, send to him from Europe, so he can begin to educate himself and get up to speed on the cutting edge science of what's going on back then. Natural philosophy, as they referred to it back then. But he's also having to import a fair number of his experimental apparatus. That takes time, and things can be damaged. There's one static machine that he imports that, apparently either never arrived or arrived damaged, and so there's a problem there. Now he gets around some of that by designing and working with local craftspeople to fabricate equipment. He designs a new type of static machine that he can then use in his experiments without having to wait for things to come over from Europe. But that has drawbacks, but it also has advantages for him. It provides his distance from the scene of the natural philosophy action, if you will, is giving him a buffer. He's not subject to immediate criticism for his ideas and thoughts and theories. He has a little bit of time, because it takes weeks, if not months, for correspondences to travel back and forth across the Atlantic. So he can sit there in Philadelphia and experiment and think and tease out his theories without immediate criticism from people who, some folks back then disparaged his theories. And they were in some areas controversial. But he was not discouraged by immediate real-time criticism. He had the time to think things through, perform the experiments, and really get his arguments together. His theory of how Lyden jars worked, for example, and his careful experiments to support that theory, caught the attention of established European researchers. That's one of the deeper areas of Franklin's influence, is his theory about what they called back then the electrical fluid, how the electrical fluid worked. The Lyden jar was developed around, discovered around 1746. And people were trying to figure out, a Lyden jar, for those who may not know, is a way to store electric charge. And you could store some pretty massive charges. Van Maschenbach, who helped, was one of the early discoverers of the Lyden jar, wrote to a friend about a terrible experiment that I advise you never to try. I thought I was going to die. That was what he wrote, because he took a huge shock from a Lyden jar. And it's a way to store charges, but how does it work? And they were really trying to figure this out. Franklin comes up with a theory of fluids and fluid surplus and deficits. And so he uses the terms positive and negative, and he's not meaning them the way we mean them today. Franklin is thinking about an excess of the fluid as a positive, a deficit of the fluid as a negative, and that the fluids want to equalize on either side of the Lyden jar. And he does a series of careful experiments where he discovers, A, you don't need water in the jar to hold the charge, and B, you don't even need a jar. You can use flat glass plates. And he comes up with what eventually becomes the flat glass plate capacitor. So his work with charges and the movement of charges is really path-breaking. His theories really spur research and spur a lot of experimentation in Europe at this time. It really serves as the foundation for what we today call capacitance, the study of capacitance and capacitors and so forth. As Philip has related, Franklin's work with lighting came to symbolize his efforts. And his goal was not to catch a lightning bolt. He kind of understood that would not be healthy. So his idea was to drain the electrical fluid from the atmosphere. And what he really wanted to do was prove that atmospheric electricity was the same stuff that you generated with a static electric machine, a glass globe or a cylinder that you would crank up against a leather pad and generate a frictional charge, just like scuffing your feet on a carpet and touching a doorknob and getting a spark. So Franklin really thinks about how might we demonstrate that atmospheric electricity is the same thing as artificially generated electricity. And he figures that if you put up a long rod, you can drain the fluid, charge a Lyden jar, and conduct experiments. And he proposes that experiment, and he's apparently waiting for the construction of a church steeple in Philadelphia so he can put up a rod. Folks in France read about a translation of his experiments, and they do the experiment successfully in May of 1752. And meanwhile, Franklin over here on this side of the Atlantic gets tired of waiting for the church steeple to be constructed and realizes he could fly a point on a kite and get it higher in the atmosphere and drain the fluid into a Lyden jar that way, and is successful with the experiment in the summer of 1752. So as the success of his experiments, the word of the success of his experiments spread, especially in Europe, that makes Franklin's worldwide reputation, and he rides that for the rest of his life. He continues to be active as a consultant. Basically, he works on commissions, studying lightning rod installations, and should you have points on the end of your lightning rod or blunt ball on the end of your lightning rod, what would work better. He's talking to people like Alessandro Volta, for example, Franklin's speculating that different materials will hold different amounts of the electrical fluid. And that attracts Volta's attention, who he comes in the 1780s to Paris when Franklin is there as ambassador from the United States, and talks to Franklin. And a few years after Franklin's death, Volta, experimenting with stacking different materials together, comes up with what we think of are the first battery that is developed. And so the Franklin's influence on Volta, we don't know exactly what they talked about, but certainly, he had some influence. And Franklin was a shrewd businessman, negotiator, and politician, and he used his fame to leverage entry into the courts of Europe, particularly in England, but later in France. He was introduced to Louis XV at first, and then years later, during the Revolution, to Louis XVI, and was lionized for his path-breaking work in electricity. So this really allowed him to then have access to these social circles and these political circles that paid dividends for the new United States during the Revolution and in the immediate aftermath of the Revolution. So his electrical work, though it occupied such a small period of his time, of his life, in terms of just a few years of active work, really established and set for the rest of his life, made his fame, made his fortune. So with that, I will thank you for your attention. Be happy to chat and take questions.
Okay, thanks, Hal. Well, that certainly does fill in the role of Benjamin Franklin as a true innovator, which we don't really get much from the mythology that surrounds him. But you mentioned the fluid theory of electricity, and this question is really directed to the both of you, perhaps starting with you, Philip. So everyone knew that there was a phenomenon of lightning. I'm not familiar with how thinking about electricity developed, but of course, what Franklin did was he, as Hal has mentioned, established the identity of atmospheric electricity from generation of electricity in other ways. But prior to that, did the fluid theory of electricity was that important or influential in the development of pre-Franklin theories of atmospheric electricity? I mean, what was the state of thinking about atmospheric electricity prior to Franklin?
Well, other people had speculated that maybe that discharges of sparks in the lab are lightning-like, and he wasn't the first to do that, but he was almost the first. And he was the first one who really had the single fluid idea behind electricity. When you generate electricity, you don't actually create anything, you just separate the positive from the negative. And I thought Hal's presentation was excellent. I also think the Smithsonian's exhibit is excellent on the development of the positive theory of the whole theory of electricity. Mm-hmm. The only thing I might add to Hal's nice presentation is that, in fact, Franklin was not alone in Philadelphia. He was working with Philip Singh and Ebenezer Kinnersley, Thomas Hopkins, and other people, friends and neighbors, all gathered around, and they were a group, the Philadelphia group. And he's not talking about his own discoveries in each case of his original work, but sometimes it was a reporting of others as part of a single group that he was actually the leader of intellectually, and certainly wrote it very clearly. He's an excellent writer. So I'm not sure I've answered your question, but I thought Hal's discussion was excellent.
Yeah, I mean, there are a number of interesting questions that come up. One of course is the intellectual freedom that goes along with intellectual isolation, so to speak. But I was just wondering what the pre-Franklin thinking on atmospheric electricity was. What was the prevailing understanding of the origin of lightning and those?
Initially, it was an act of God.
Yeah.
And in fact, some of Franklin's work created objections in the religious community for interfering with the will of God. But Franklin's attitude was, it's okay to have a lightning rod on your roof to provide protection. It's just like having the roof up there for rain. You're always staying under the roof to keep out the rain. Well, if you stay under the lightning rod to be safe from lightning, you're doing essentially the same thing.
Yeah. And that was the thing, as Philip said, people had, thought for many, many decades that atmospheric electricity probably was the same kind of thing. There's active research on electrical science that, going on back to the ancients in Greece, but in particular, Gilbert's publication of De Magnete around 1600 begins to kick off this empirical period of research, and he looks at electrical traction and so forth, as well as his magnetic work. And people like von Guericke, who are coming up with the sulfur type ball to frictionally generate electricity, and demonstrating levitation of feathers and things of that nature. People are looking at lightning and going, okay, this just looks like a great big spark, and it sounds like a great big magnified spark. And then to a certain extent, they're right. But how do you prove it? What experiment can you do to prove that? And that was really Franklin's, intellectual breakthrough there. Was, coming up with a practical way and using the relatively new Lyden jar as a way to store charges that, yes, he got his spark off his key that was tied to the kite string to his knuckle. But you really needed to charge the Lyden jar so that you could then perform the experiments that a lot of people knew about, because various static machines had been built. There was, new types of static machines becoming available in that era of the 1700s, 1720s, 30s, and 40s. And that also stimulated Franklin, as well as other researchers. Quite correct, he's not the only one in Philadelphia or on this side of the Atlantic doing that research. He certainly is, actively corresponding with people in Europe, particularly Peter Collinson, but others as well, and pushing this research forward and just trying to understand what's going on.
This notion that innovation comes from isolation from the conventional wisdom it's really a fascinating one for me. I know that Franklin founded the American Philosophical Society. Am I right there? Yeah, and of course, what I know of it seems to draw. There seem to be pretty substantial parallels with groups like the Lunar Society in Northern England. I think they came after the American Philosophical Society founding. But there's something to be said for. Well, and there was a great deal of innovation that came from that group, of course. Steam engines. Erasmus Darwin was thinking about evolution in some odd ways, which turned out to be kind of an interesting predecessor to his grandson's own thoughts. And we emphasize science today as a very cooperative venture. But of course, the creativity of being able to be liberated from the kind of the conventional wisdom is an interesting dynamic in the practice of science, which I wonder, are we losing today?
Yeah.
Do you think?
Well, and to be sure, Franklin is dependent on people like Cullinson and others over
Mhm.
in Europe to keep him apprised of the cutting edge research, to
Mhm.
keep sending the journals and the books and so forth over, and then early experimental equipment. The rubbing tube, the glass rubbing tube that Cullinson sent over to Franklin early on is preserved in the Franklin Institute, actually in Philadelphia today. So he is dependent on in many, as we researchers are to this day, dependent on collaboration and conversation. And in this instance, it was more having the ability to not do it in real time, to have that buffer, that delay, so that he could think things through. That seems to have really been a part of what helped him be successful.
Fascinating. Philip, did you have anything to add to that?
I agree with practically everything Hal has said, and that we'll just point out that Franklin knew about the action of electricity creating magnets when the current flows through an iron substance. It depolarized or compasses on ships and stuff like that happened well before a more detailed discussion that came later.
Mhm.
So he had to get out of the field of electricity a little bit too early to fully explore the magnetic effects of current.
Yeah.
But he was on the right track.
Yeah, fascinating character, and it's also fascinating to me that he had to become a man of independent means before he could venture into science, which of course is the dilemma of our modern career-oriented approach to science, which is that you depend strongly on things like the opinion of the people who sign the checks to be able to have a scientific career, and I've known a few people in the current time who are independently wealthy like that, and they often come up with very imaginative ways of approaching science, and it's just an observation that I wanted to put out there. I wonder if we are actually effectively supporting science better than was the case in Franklin's day.
It's in many respects, yes, because we have such, just as one example, we have such an influx of research money coming from the federal government, for example, whether it's NASA or NOAA or the Smithsonian or wherever. We have a lot of public support for that kind of research that really didn't exist in Franklin's day, and then for many years after. This was something that developed during the 19th century. This idea of public funding for science research is, early on, the idea was more that was something that would be done in the academy, the universities would do, or private philanthropers like James Smithson would set up organizations like the Smithsonian that would perform this kind of research on behalf of the public. For us, it's for the increase and diffusion of knowledge, was in Smithson's will. So this idea that the government would support science and research, that comes about later, and certainly that has affected the course of research in many fields in a variety of ways, some good, some maybe not so good, but that, to me, that's the biggest difference between the nature of funding research back in Franklin's day and for many years after and today.
Remarkable thing that I drew from your presentation, Philip, is how there wasn't really a division between Franklin's basic science and Franklin's applied science. What came out of that was an incredible example of applied science, because it had actually real world immediate effects on people's well-being. And as there's a pretty vigorous ongoing debate right now about what kinds of science we should fund in the universities, and basic versus applied is a significant part of that. So I think what you're saying is that really Franklin was the original proponent, if you will, for there's really no difference between the applied and the basic.
Right. And he was very good at applying anything he could discover that was new. Yeah. Amazing fellow. Before we get to the Q&A, do either of you have any additional comments to make?
Well, just one point about that in terms of invention is that Franklin didn't patent. He did not really believe in patents. He believed that, if you create it and you put it out there and you can better the human condition, that was what he, believed was what it was all about, the study of natural philosophy and science and so forth. Franklin stove or bifocals or lightning rods, he's, all about just, getting it out there.
Being useful was a very important thing to Franklin. Any aspect of his work and that was useful, was very important to him.
Yeah, the concept of patents was actually pretty well established by Franklin's time, right? Yeah. There was mainly through royal charter, though, wasn't it? Or was there something else going on there that undergirded the concept of patents?
No, that's pretty much what's going on over there. Of course, it's what leads the founders here when they're writing the Constitution to make sure that there's a clause covering patents in our Constitution.
Okay, well, let's go to the Q&A. We have a few comments in there, and please put your comments in. We'll start with the ones that we have, and as the discussion goes on, please feel free to add more. So let's go to the Q&A thing, and Larry answers. Franklin was long dead in 1811 by the time that John Adams made his remarks. So was Adams' admiration of Franklin? I know he was loathed by certain political factions in the United States, and because of his supposedly free thinking and immoral ways. But what went into the evolution of Adams's increasingly good opinion of Franklin, who during his lifetime he didn't like very much?
Early in Franklin's career, they were close. Before about the mid 1770s, and later, when Franklin became an ambassador effectively in Paris, John Adams joined him to serve as a negotiator. And he didn't like the idea of cooperation quite like Franklin did. And he was a proud man and didn't like some of the treatment of Franklin relative to his own treatment. And at some point, Franklin wrote an opinion of Adams back to the president of the Continental Congress, something like, John Adams is always an honest man, frequently a very wise one, and sometimes he does things absolutely out of his senses. How he related the ambassadorial work, and that was pretty damaging as far as Adams' interpretation of it. And I don't think it was really true, but it may be that he was out of his senses trying to negotiate with the French as an ambassador relative to Franklin. There was really no comparison. And I think it was the ambassadorial work and the differences of treating countries and people in Paris that led to this split. And then whether it was really over by 1711, or 1811, I don't know. I mean, Adams didn't like Franklin for the rest of his life, as far as I know.
Okay,
Yes. So far as I can, tell from reading the sources and the correspondences and so forth, it's basically, I think, a big difference in style. Franklin was very much, if you want to say it this way, a schmoozer. He knew how to work. He knew how to get in there and shake hands and had that, down home, if you will, style. But he had the ability to maneuver in the social circles, whereas Adams much more proud and much more, staid in many ways. He just that kind of style just kind of grated on Adams.
Adams was basically a New Englander.
Right.
Right. Yeah.
Maybe a little stronger religious views, and they just didn't match Franklin.
Yeah. Whenever I've spoken about Franklin in my classes, I usually use that famous photograph of him dressed up as a frontiersman with a leather cap, and I know he also affected some Native American costumery and things like this, which I'm sure also rubbed Adams the wrong way, being a staid New Englander, and so basically it was differences of style during their respective diplomatic careers that led to the division between them. That's fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and Adams never got
a really
over
good question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
the Adams relationship is really a good question, because I don't know the full answer.
Yeah, and Hal, as far as you know, that he just held a lifelong animosity, but could nevertheless find something admirable in Franklin.
Right, and as Philip said, they were close early on. Certainly, and collaborated closely. It's just, I think, as time went on, this difference in style just
Interesting. Yeah. So Barton Lane, going on to the next question, and I think we'll have some interesting discussions about this. He says, great presentation. Do any of you know about the discovery of the Gulf Stream? And P.S. his autobiography is one of the best reads. I certainly will second that last sentence, and I'm going to be prompted to reread his autobiography, which is really one of the classics of American literature. But what was this implies that there was some connection between the Gulf Stream and Franklin's discovery of it. Can you fill in that picture a little bit?
He measured the temperature of the ocean on Franklin crossed the Atlantic, I think, a total of about 8 times. And on the last 2 or 3, he regularly did experiments measuring the water temperature, and was able to trace the path of the Gulf Stream and publish it as a map or something.
Wow.
I'm not quite sure whether he was the first to do that, but I know he was very interested in the Gulf Stream because it made the voyage to Europe shorter than the voyage back, or vice versa.
Yeah.
And he was very interested in the applications relating to the Gulf Stream in both.
Like what kinds of applications?
And the wind and stuff like that.
Yeah. What do you have some examples of the kinds of applications that Franklin speculated upon about the Gulf Stream?
Well, he speculated about the transport of heat from southern latitudes to northern latitudes, and the regular atmospheric circulations that tended to persist and contribute to the source of the Gulf Stream. But I'm afraid I'm not an expert on
that. So he was a proto-climatologist.
He was a founder of that kind of thinking, the regular motions of the fluid earth.
Yeah. Al, can you fill in any of this picture?
No, I have to admit I'm not expert on that set of experiments. As Philip said, I know he was taking those measurements on his transatlantic
Yeah.
crossings and recording his findings and so forth.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I'm not
Yeah. Okay.
up to date on that.
Okay. So moving on then, Dave Peterson asked, what do we use for lightning protection today? Is it built into building electrical circuitry and ground? And, as far as I know, it's still the basic technology that Franklin invented.
I think the basic idea of a lightning rod acting as an alternate path that would cause the current to flow harmlessly to ground is still the one that they use, the National Fire Protection Association so-called lightning protection code. But in addition to that, lightning is now known to create large electromagnetic disturbances that radiate large distances at very large amplitudes. And some of those transients are best protected against with lightning arresters, which provide protection against big overvoltages.
Yeah. So how does a lightning arrestor differ from a lightning rod? It's
well, they're both very similar, except the lightning arrestor won't turn on unless it sees something, a very rapid overvoltage.
Oh.
And it also will transfer it to ground, very similar to a lightning rod.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's kind of a smart lightning rod then.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting.
And
yeah.
When you get involved in the details, it becomes interesting and complex.
What's even more
you need
interesting,
shielding that's protect against the transients.
Yeah. Yeah.
what is even more interesting, I think, is the protection for smaller, not just lightning, but for smaller static discharges. I'm thinking here of electronics that come packed in static resistant packages and so forth, and the role of various, if you will, microstatic discharges, and the protection that we have to design into equipment for those today.
Yeah.
That Franklin would certainly, have understood the need for.
Yeah. Yeah. So, okay. So this moving on, DM Herder has an interesting questions. To what do you attribute Franklin's constant push for practical application of knowledge? This is in caps. In an age when European intellectuals were generally theorists. Very interesting question. Jefferson also sought practical applications, emphasized, which he called useful knowledge. So why was Franklin focused on application, whereas his more effete European contemporaries were not?
My impression here is that this is part of Franklin's upbringing. Basically, he is, from a large family of craftspeople. His father was a candle maker. He grows up, working with his hands, working in these crafts. The initial junto that he founds in Philadelphia is called the Leather Apron Society. So he has this appreciation for the hands-on crafts and the need to create and make things of a practical nature that people can use. So he's not someone of the landed gentry. He's not someone who's born into wealth and who can undertake scientific research because he has nothing else to do, really. Franklin gets interested in these things after he's, basically, becomes wealthy as a printer and retires from printing. But I think it really stems from his personal background and his upbringing, and that really gives him and others as well an appreciation of the trades.
Yeah. Yes. Philip, anything to add to that?
Only that even when he was participating in the Constitutional Convention, 1787, whether it would work or not, various schemes, whether the unicameral or bicameral legislature or the thing that whether it could be made to work, very important to him. And he hated slavery toward the end of his life. He was president of the anti-slavery societies in Philadelphia, and one of his first petition to the Congress was to abolish slavery.
Mhm.
And of course, that wasn't possible with the Congress as it was constituted. So
Yeah, yeah. Is it fair to say that most of his contemporaries in Europe were generally theorists? Is that a fair characterization of that? I mean, I mentioned the Lunar Society in Northern England for a little bit, and there's amazing parallels between what you're saying about Franklin as being a practical-minded person first, and then also curious and intellectual about nature. And of course, it was around steam and those kinds of issues in the Lunar Society. But is it fair to say that European intellectuals were more kind of theorists and not really into...
they came from a different background, and I think they were, at least in the universities, more interested in how the theory evolved and what was rational than what would work.
Yeah. Al?
No, I think that's generally correct. There's certainly folks in Europe who are experimentalists and who are adopting these, but in that era, you really have to either be a craftsman to create the equipment, or have really good, relationship with someone who is someone who can fabricate these devices that you need, and they're becoming increasingly sophisticated as they're trying to, the way we do today, we theorize and then create a multi-billion-dollar space telescope to try to track down and confirm our theories. As the theories progress and become more sophisticated, you need more sensitive instruments to detect the effects, and that requires a level of craft that is not beyond everyone, but it's beyond many.
Yeah. Wayne Merrill has a little bit of a provocative question here. He says that Adams came from the Puritan background, as we've already mentioned, whereas Franklin liked the ladies, especially in French society, and that got under Adams's Puritan skin. Can either of you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah. I think that again gets back to the personality, not clash, but the personality differences again between Adams and Franklin. Franklin was a socialite. And a lot of that was, because he wanted to be, but also because he understood that society and politics are intertwined in that era, and you need to be in the company of people who are influencers, as we would term it today. He's, posing for a portrait by one painter, Van Loo, who in 1777, late in 1777, premieres a new painting showing an electrostatic experiment that's going on. And I don't know this, I'm still researching this to try to figure it out, but there's a decent chance that Franklin was a technical advisor to this painter whose patron had requested a portrait of the famous Dr. Franklin. So, there are all of these intertwined and intermeshed between society and politics back then. And Franklin is very aware of them. Adams is aware of them too, but Franklin, I think, my impression is Franklin's a little more comfortable swimming in that pond, where Adams is, maybe it's his Puritan background, as you say, but he's not as comfortable doing that.
So who do you think was the better ambassador to France, Franklin or Adams?
But Franklin was able to get a lot of money.
It was, I think it was the recent Ken Burns piece ago. Someone was arguing, might have been Condoleezza Rice, was arguing that they made a good team, almost a good cop, bad cop team.
Okay. Yeah. Interesting.
that it was the combination of the two of them together that really helped.
Okay. Yeah, that's interesting. Okay. That's
Mhm.
so the last question here is a historical one, and of course it's not the predecessors of Franklin, but Franklin's own predecessors. And Larry asks, did Michael Faraday know Franklin? And certainly Michael Faraday came along a little bit better. But can either of you tell us anything about the relationship between Faraday and Franklin?
Well, Franklin was clearly first,
Yes.
and Faraday liked the work of Franklin and used some of that in his work.
Mm-hmm.
But I actually was interested in how the work of Franklin affected Faraday, and other than the basic stuff, I can't think of anything.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know Faraday came along quite a bit later. His main period of activity was actually considerably after the kind of golden decade that you described, Hal. But but they didn't know each other. Did they correspond, or did they
No.
have any personal interaction at all? So.
And Faraday was more like John Adams in his personal life.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And I don't think liked the kind of life Franklin led, in the diplomatic arena.
Oh, that's interesting.
But he didn't have time to really explore the magnetic interactions or the magnetic induction and stuff that Faraday is so famous for.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I'm not aware of any interaction between them directly. Certainly, Franklin's work was influential for pretty much everyone who came afterwards. Even if they were disproving his theories or going beyond his theories, they were still aware of his work.
Yeah. Perhaps more relevant is did Franklin know Faraday's own mentor, Humphrey Davy? Is there any evidence of personal interaction between those men?
I don't know of any, and Davy and the and the chemistry and the applications of electricity and dissolving, and changing the chemical state of stuff was more came later.
I
have to admit I'm not aware of interactions there either.
Yeah. So which European or British scientists do you think Franklin influenced most directly?
Well, the earlier ones, the Watsons and Watson was probably the greatest.
Okay.
In the British literature.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, this was a fascinating discussion. We're out of questions. Do we have any closing statements for before we sign out and say goodbye? Philip, do you have a closing bit of wisdom to impart?
I think it's too bad that some of our politicians don't have the spirit of Franklin. In a controversy, no matter what it was, he would always give a little and ask to take a little, and in exchange to get along and get through it. And I wish we had more of that amongst our diplomats and political leaders.
Yeah. Compromise is becoming a bit of a lost art, isn't it?
Yeah.
Hal, any closing thoughts from you?
Yeah, and that kind of thing certainly extended over into Franklin's scientific work, where he is being attacked by the Abbé Nollet, for example, and he's being encouraged to respond, and he basically says, "No, if my theories are correct, they'll stand on their own. If I'm wrong, I deserve to be disproved. Please." Tell me I'm wrong. Show me the experiments. So that kind of commitment to the self-correction that we all want for science today. That I think is a notable, part of Franklin's legacy as well.
Yeah, so he was kind of the original Popperian philosopher of science, wasn't he? Is what you're saying. Falsibility is really at the heart of it. Yeah. Okay, well, Hal Wallace and Phil Krider, thank you for joining us today on American Innovation. It was a fascinating discussion. I really enjoyed talking to you and getting to know you and learning more about Benjamin Franklin and actually how much of an innovator he was. That's an important message to get out. So again, thank you very much. Next time, David Randa will be sitting in this seat, and I'm not sure what the next American Innovation is going to be, but it's bound to be the next in this fascinating series of webinars. So thank you to the both of you for joining us today. And for the audience, come back at the next American Innovation webinar. Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you.